Hi, Susan. I'm going to add you to the stream so we can chat now.
How are you?
Good.
It's nice to meet you finally.
Yeah, it's nice to meet you also. It's two people with the same last name within 2 hours. It's interesting.
You know, how fortuitous.
Yeah. Does that name mean something? Because like I don't know what that would mean, the last name.
We're brother and sister, and this is the first conference that we've ever done together. So it's sort of a big milestone.
That
for me anyway. He's done a lot.
Yeah, so we're super happy to have you. And I guess we can get started, maybe.
Yeah, I'm
so
ready.
If you wanna, share your screen.
Sure.
All right, so I'm gonna share it now. And so it's my pleasure to introduce Susan, who's gonna be talking about how to GRC or DevOps.
Great, thank you.
Get started.
Sure. I gave a talk similar to this at RSA earlier this year. This one's a little bit shorter and hopefully a little bit more focused for the audience. But like Sasha said, I'm Sue Allspaw Pomeroy. I am the senior manager for the compliance team at Fastly, and I've been doing security and compliance for over 15 years now, and some people think I'm crazy for that. Before that, I taught at university, and I'm a published poet. So I bring a lot of different skills, I guess, to this space. So today, I want to talk about DevOps and GRC collaboration, but to understand sort of where I've come from, I want to start with a little story. I left a .gov audit job and entered into a tech startup. And when I did, I had a very lively conversation with an ops person that I know about change management. And it went like this. I said, you can't have change control that's effective if you don't have manager approval and a meeting with all of your stakeholders so they can, of course, tell you what's wrong. To which he replied, what's better is if you have peer review and automated tests. And I said, yeah, but all of the frameworks say that you have to have manager approval. And he said, but the managers aren't really close to the changes that that you're wanting. And it's safer to have engineers who are closer to that code to do reviews and to have those automated tests. Well, we've continued to have this conversation on and on. We continue to learn from each other to this day. And that's the key that I want for us today, is to start this conversation and to continue to have it between those folks who end up doing audit and those folks who build the systems that we are auditing. So all of this started when James Wickett asked this question on Twitter a little while ago. And I sort of kind of shook my head because I've been working in tech for a while. I've been sitting next to my engineering and operations departments in meetings with them pretty much every day. And I thought everybody was doing this. And it turns out not so much, right? GRC's been next to DevOps through the past decade of evolution of DevOps practices, but GRC's been very busy adapting and evolving on their own based on data breaches and lots of new legislation. And GRC's been sort of more reactive instead of being able to look at and evolve with the positive change that DevOps has brought to the industry. So the short version of what I'm here to tell you today is that DevOps and GRC collaboration is going to make audits smoother for your auditors and your engineers, and everybody will end up happier in the end. I want to challenge any auditors in the audience to think about how they're viewing those traditional controls, and that we have to change those views, and we should change those views. But the key that I really want us to come away with is that when we calibrate how things work between our ops and our dev and our security and our audit organizations, that is going to be the foundation of more resilient systems. So let's start with why I think security frameworks are your friends. They're built on very sound security measures and tenets that everybody wants, and they're meant to be, and they're written to be flexible to your business based on the risk profile of what you do for your business. They're also there. They also enable engineering teams to get what they want, which is visibility and tooling that they need to do their jobs better. Security frameworks also give your business the reason to put in the security programs that you want to do anyway. As you know, security usually costs a lot of money. So having a framework that you're audited against sort of gives you that reason. However, frameworks have also inadvertently been very unclear on how to implement the very sort of non-specific requirements that they have. And if they're implemented in a way that's super complex or in a way that's at a risk level that's maybe higher than what the business needs, that has the capability to create some serious business slowdowns. Security frameworks can also be interpreted as being super rigid. And when you implement a lot of rigidity in those controls, it makes folks do things in a way that's contrary to the way that they would work naturally. I want to caveat here, some security controls have rigidity to them, so this isn't entirely misplaced. And then security frameworks also make a whole lot of paperwork. And as an auditor, this is very true, and this is the part of my job that I hate. I think everybody remembers what CAB meetings were like, right? So let's get down to the basics of what we want. Auditors, we want something super simple. We want effective security controls that can be evidenced and that are repeatable. And engineers, well, they want stable systems. And when the systems aren't stable, they want to be able to improve and respond super quickly. They also want to have a common systems understanding across all of their teams, across engineering and operations. And they want to have as much visibility into the systems as possible so that they can see how they're operating. Your security teams want, well, they want secure enough systems. They want well-tested code that includes testing to the OWASP top 10. They want visibility to unusual activity, but they want to be able to define that specifically so they're not woken up at 2 a.m. when someone sudos into production. And they want rule following with systems and with people so that when somebody does sudo into a box at 2 a.m. because of an incident or an outage, they're not necessarily woken up because that's considered maybe normal behavior. This list of what we want for all of these different organizations isn't a full list of everything that we want, but it does highlight some areas of similarity. We all want resiliency. We all want visibility and an ability to respond quickly, and we all want quality in the systems that we run. But how we want it is super different. Engineers don't care that they can evidence that they've done their job. They just want to be able to do their jobs. And auditors don't care how fast we fix things or do things. We just want them to be super methodical and documented. Remember, perfect is often the enemy of good enough, except for when you have to explain an exception on your SOC 2 report to your customers and your executive leadership. The key here is that we all want to make our jobs easier. And our goals aren't to force our methods. So when I say our, I mean auditors and engineers and security folks. We don't want to impose the way we think on other areas of the business. Our goal is to calibrate with the other areas of the business so that our common goals, right, we're all working toward the same business goals, which includes risk reduction. We want to be able to reach those. And that's really the goal of any compliance framework. In order to do that, though, we have to start minimizing the gap between work as imagined, which is how security controls and frameworks are designed, and work as done, which is how security is actually accomplished. So where we position ourselves within these mental models of how things work is going to be the key to how we get the DevOps principles and the GRC principles calibrated and aligned. If you haven't read The Varieties of Human Work by Stephen Chirac, and I've put a link here, please go do so. This is, it's super seminal, and I'm mostly going to focus on work as imagined and work as done today. So Workers Imagined starts with how we design frameworks and controls. It usually starts with, in a perfect world, I would do something this way. And then we draw a process flow diagram and we write a wiki page on how to do this. And then as auditors, we're like, this is great. It'll work all the time this way, right? Unfortunately, the way work is actually done is like this. It's super messy. We may start with a process flow and a process document, and then an operator will start seeing some, getting some other indicators or getting additional information. And then they'll start deviating from that process in order to meet their goals. Remember, it's visibility into the system. It's keeping the systems stable. It's understanding what's going on in the system. And those things, meeting those goals, may or may not actually follow procedure. So you all might remember in 2009 when Captain Sullenberger landed US Airways Flight 1549 in the Hudson after 2 bird strikes. This is a prime example that I always like to use about an operator using their expertise and their adaptive capacity to keep a system safe. In this case, the system was the aircraft and the passengers and crew on board. This isn't something you can write into a procedure. Right? How this crew was able to land this plane and not have any fatalities is testament to their adaptive capacity. It's not something that we should react to like we have with certain data breaches, et cetera, and adapt it into a framework either. Sidney Decker says, procedures are an investment in safety, but not always. Procedures are thought to be required to achieve safe practice, yet they are not always necessary, nor likely ever sufficient for creating safety. And that's the key here, nor likely ever sufficient for creating safety. What we seem to want as auditors is for processes to be performed accurately and consistently all the time. But that's antithetical to keeping a system safe. If the question is dealing with whether you have an exception on an audit report or you have an extended outage that's going to affect your customers and your revenue, I promise you procedures and controls are going to change because reality is always going to trump procedure. So when you're designing a security control or process, ask yourselves, and by yourselves I mean auditors and engineers, what is the risk you're trying to mitigate? What are the goals for this process or control? I promise you what's in your head as an auditor isn't the same thing that's in the head of yourself as an engineer, and is also different from what's in the head of your product manager and your security engineer. So once you explicitly answer this question across those boundaries, you're going to start establishing that common ground you need to reach the same goal, which is that risk reduction and more resilient systems. So these are the 2 things we're talking about: reasonable assurance that a control is in place and timely detection when that control can't be in place. Now, reasonable and timely are normative terms, so you're going to want to define this because what's reasonable for one company is not going to be reasonable for another, and what's timely for one security control isn't going to be timely for another either. Back in the day when I started in security, the cloud was a super scary place and no one wanted to go there, especially the government. And so this was one of the funny things people would post on their cubicle walls, right? The best security control is the one that keeps us disconnected, right? Especially from the cloud. So reasonable assurance isn't looking for a control that works 100% of the time. But we do want to know when things go wrong. I love this tweet by Jessica DeVito, who's speaking later today. The safest aircraft never flies. The safest anesthesia is never given. All operators in risky domains must find and adjust the balance between acute, faster, better, cheaper goals and chronic goals such as safety. This is where we as auditors have to realize the adaptive capacity of our engineers are one of the best security controls that we can have in place. So let's talk about one of my favorite security controls. And by favorite, I don't mean favorite, separation of duties. So according to NIST, separation of duties addresses the potential for abuse of authorized privileges and helps reduce the risk of malevolent activity without collusion. Sort of the key there is without collusion. This control typically has been used in terms of financial systems and fraud, right? You don't want the person who requested the check to process the check or sign the check, but it doesn't really all translate that well into our IT systems, which we have traditionally translated it to. So in the past, we've seen this cardinal rule, right, of devs write the code and ops deploys and maintains the code, and it, the past decade has shown us that it hasn't worked so well, and DevOps has worked really hard to sort of change that paradigm. And yet GRC still insists on imposing this as a security control. So what's happened is while trying to implement this security control of separation of duties, we're enabling and enforcing more risk on our systems. So the problem has always been that separation of duties is assumed to require multiple humans as primary operators of different functions. And this causes this conflict between audit and engineering, right? One reduces risk, and the other ends up reducing productivity, right? It's a slowdown and a risk potentially to systems resiliency. So there's a whole lot of complexity that's associated with separation of duties, and oftentimes we don't end up telling each other the stories that the stories of what we need out of that work. So you may have an engineer who's saying, in an outage, I have to be able to fix the system without a whole lot of people. I have to be able to be fast. This is important for the business. This is important for my goals. And then your internal audit team is saying, but we have to have separate people to develop and deploy because the regulations say so. Your product people are saying, but if we can't move quickly, we can't beat our competition to solve that customer problem. And in the meantime, your CEO is sort of stuck in the middle, right? If we get a finding on our audit, we'll lose the trust of our customers. But if the systems are down, we're going to lose that too. A couple of other challenges that we see related to separation of duties is when a control or process activity is written for its process for process sake, right? And Decker refers to this sometimes as malicious compliance. That means that when you're following a process to the letter, it removes that capability to adapt. It actually causes more risk to your systems. It reduces the capability to adapt to situations that the process wasn't even designed to cover. And it couldn't even consider it because they didn't know when they were developing that process to begin with. Close behind that is the idea of checkbox compliance, which is when you've got controls that are in place and procedures that are in place, and the only benefit that they give to the business is that you pass an audit, is that it's only for audit. Eventually, you're going to have situations where the reasons and the context behind why you do that thing is completely lost. And when that is lost, and that sort of communal knowledge isn't passed on from one team or one engineer to another, that thing that seems meaningless just doesn't happen anymore. And that will cause some visibility issues and additional risk, right? Both of these equal higher business risk. So ask yourselves, when you're trying to implement separation of duties, what is the risk that you're trying to mitigate? Is it fraud? Is it authorized access for unauthorized activities? Are you trying to sort of mitigate that insider threat? How likely is that insider threat considering everything else that you have in place? You're never going to have the same answer, especially depending on what you're applying separation of duties to. But you want to dig in and ask those specific questions. What systems, what data, what teams, what business drivers are the security control trying to answer for? It may be financial risk. It may be availability risk. Sometimes human separation is really the answer. And I've, sort of begrudgingly, accepted this over the past few years. But it's not always the only answer. So how can we be okay with engineers deploying their own code? I get this question a lot from other auditors who seem really scared about allowing engineers to deploy their own code. Well, first, we trust engineers use their expertise to adapt, right? We actually have controls in all of our security frameworks for this. We ask for background checks. We ask for performance reviews. We want to make sure that that folks with the right qualifications are hired to do this work. That is allowing folks to use their expertise to adapt. The other thing that we can do is make sure that we have a safe and transparent environment so that when a procedure has to be deviated from in order to meet those goals, folks can come forward and talk about those deviations in order to change those processes to become more efficient. The psychological safety is super important because otherwise you won't know when folks have deviated from a particular process. And again, that causes more risk. This is putting in place some guardrails for folks, not speed bumps. But you can't audit trust, right? So we do have ways in which we can make sure that we verify that things are okay for audit. We can do that through transparency, right? We have lots of logs, we have lots of evidence and artifacts, and we have visibility into how our DevOps practices work. We can also make sure that we understand as auditors our tools and our people involved in these processes. So we can utilize the CI/CD pipeline for deployments, right? And thereby have lots of logs to show exactly what happened. We can also make sure that we put in place the knowledge share of people and tools doing code review. We can also invite our security friends to make sure that they're in on the story by reviewing anomalies, sharing that information with our engineering and ops departments and audit as well. And so how do we get there? We get here by having effective communication. And I know that sometimes communication can be super difficult. Your compliance team or internal audit may sit, may sit under your finance team or your law team. Sometimes compliance sits within the security team, which is nice. Sometimes security sits under engineering. And so there aren't those silos to create. Sometimes you have an internal tools team. Sometimes you're small enough, you don't have a tool like that. So we want to make sure that we try to break down these silos, and I'm going to talk about a couple of ways that we can do that. So yeah, communication is hard. Typically, some of the challenges that we have are when information is shared, it's shared among sort of managerial level, and it doesn't filter down the same way depending on who that manager is, right? That horrible game of telephone. We also have work for audits is usually requested in haste during an audit, very short audit timeframe, and it's without context. Please give me that screen capture from that config tool, and because I need it for the external auditors. But that engineer probably hasn't done that in a year, if it's even the same engineer who did it for you last year. The other challenge that we have is time, right? We're all busy at 100% or 110% doing the job that we're there to do. So how can I make more time to meet with folks of these other organizations that I maybe have an idea of what they're going to ask me to do, right? So I beg of you, make friends with your compliance teams and do this by not inviting them out for beverages, but invite them to your meetings. Put them on your engineering distribution lists. This way, they learn and understand more about how you work, which makes them more empathetic to designing those security controls and processes to match how you work, right? And hey, auditors, make sure you go to those, read those emails, go to those all hands meetings, and talk to folks in those organizations. And the next thing is we want to establish common ground, right? So what do engineers know about your security controls and frameworks? Sometimes it's only what what they've gleaned from those audit requests. What do auditors know about the systems and engineering and tools that your business supports? Make sure that you as an auditor know what your tech stack looks like. You don't have to code it, you just have to know it. and ask each other, what's going to make your job easier? And this way we can design those processes better. The other thing that you can do is establish workable internal checks. So this means and monthly or quarterly recurring activities. Make sure that you work together when those are there. So so that you can oh, I'm so sorry. So that you can find ways that those processes are maybe not working so well for folks. But the key with this one is make sure that psychological safety is there. Internal checks aren't to get people in trouble. They are to help improve those processes. If you have an infrastructure product manager, make sure they're in your audit planning meetings, because they're going to be able to take a whole lot of information back to your organization. And share your controls matrix with engineering, publicize it. If you get a lot of questions about it, it means they don't know a lot about it and you've got some work to do, right? And then go to product meetings. The best thing you can do is understand what's in the planning process so that you can feed those security controls in at the front end of your development. So I'll leave you with this. Systems break, processes are deviated from. This is normal work. What we have to understand and rely on is that people's ability to adapt to adverse situations is going to be the strongest security control that we can have. I have a lot of references, and I will make these slides available online, and I'm happy to talk about any questions that you have.
So we don't have a lot of questions coming in right now, but we do have a couple comments saying that people love this talk.
Oh, thank you.
I will say, so for now, I want to ask about my own questions. So I've seen organizations where people just don't trust each other. And so there's a lot of this like, okay, I can't let my, engineers push to production. And my usual answer is like, you hired these people? Like why would you hire them if you don't trust them, right? But there's also like the non-pathological state where people are required by some type of government regulation to follow procedures that don't make sense anymore. Like how do you get over that?
So typically the way that I've addressed this is to ask, typically our security frameworks say, they don't say how you do something, they say that you have to do a thing to achieve an end, right? Some of them, again, are pretty prescriptive, but you can have separation of duties with machines and not people. And so, DevOps is sort of built on some of that automation and stuff. And so the more visibility you give to auditors, the better they feel about the security controls that they think are supposed to be in place. And so it's kind of like a change my mind moment, right? And so I've had long conversations with external auditors to kind of show them, we've remembered what's the risk that we're trying to mitigate. Why are you asking me to have this thing in place if we've reduced the risk that this thing was intended to mitigate? I want to show you that we've mitigated it. It may not be the way that you thought that I should mitigate it, but we've mitigated it.
So another question, great talk. Any recommendations for the first steps on this path to follow?
Lots of talking and lots of listening. So I think that the best thing that ever happened to me was to make a lot of friends and listen a lot to our operations group who told me how our platform worked. And so just as an audit, if the person who's asking the question is an auditor, go to your engineers and just listen to understand what is their day like? How do they do their jobs, right? And if you're an engineer, like really go ask your auditor folks, how do you do this job every day? What is this, why are you asking me to do this, right? And have those just honest conversations. A lot of the challenges that we have are that people bring assumptions, right? About, like you said, about trust, right? I don't trust auditors to know what I should be doing. I don't trust engineers to do the right thing. I mean, if we start with a basis of trust and develop that sort of that common ground, right? That understanding, then we're going to come a lot closer.
So another question that you kind of plugs into what you just said. Do you think auditors and security should be members of the two pizza team?
So I have had the privilege to work within as a compliance person within a security team. And I have had the privilege of working on a compliance team that does not report in directly, have direct reporting structure into the security team. I absolutely do think that it's very effective. It's more effective to be sort of embedded in that security team. I know some folks think that there's a separation of duties issue, and especially with some frameworks, that's absolutely true. So it's really going to depend on what the need is of your business.
So there was the question if you and John got along growing up, and also a request for you to finish with a poem.
Oh my goodness. Yes, we got along. Someday you can ask him about his breakdancing capabilities. And sure. Wow. I wasn't actually prepared for this, but sure. We have 1 minute. Okay. This is, God, is this appropriate to read on the internet?
I think so.
So this is a poem called Swallowing Antarctica. It's a sonnet. When we round the bend in Charlotte's Bay, when the bow breaks through ice like sugar candy in a child's hand, when light breaks over snow-capped mountains like a heaven or a miracle, I prefer this side, starboard, where the sun licks first and where, if I were to jump, I would not be missed for hours. And if I were to jump, catch an ice floe and ride it north, or sink into that sky where penguins fly, I would swallow all Antarctic relics, men and science alike, embody ancient ice and waters teeming with life, caught in evolution and frozen, a blueprint, a map on which to chart a course.
Wow. That is beautiful. And
thank you
so much. This is like, I'm ending my hosting for this conference right now. Someone else is going to be taking over. So this was just a perfect, and thank you.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate it. Thanks so much. This has been a great experience. Thanks all the talks as well.
All right.